Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. And welcome to our Women on Wednesday series. We're glad you're here for our first event of the fall semester. For those of you who may be new to some of our events, WPI is a nonpartisan institute and nonprofit institute in AU's School of Public Affairs, and we aim to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic courses, practical campaign training. We facilitate research and conversations like this on women in leadership. And we are really excited to have a special guest for tonight, Kweilin Ellingrud. She is a senior partner at McKinsey and Company, where she leads their McKinsey Global Institute, which is their research arm. And she has spent years studying gender equality, racial equality, the future of work, and economic competitiveness. She is also the author of the new book, The Broken Rung. It takes a really hard look at the challenges that women face early in their careers, and more importantly, I think offers strategies for how we can overcome those. And what I really like about this book is that it blends sort of this rigorous research with personal stories and practical advice. And so it's a toolkit for women who really want to grow their careers and a guide for leaders who want to create those kind of workplaces where women can thrive. So we're thrilled to have her with us tonight to share what she's learned and to talk about how we can really all play a role in breaking down those barriers. So we will, of course, save plenty of time for your questions. Just look at the bottom of your screen for the Q&A button and feel free to submit them as we go along. But welcome, Kweilin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Betsy. It's a pleasure.
So we often hear about this kind of glass ceiling, lots of conversations about that, right? This
Mhm.
barrier that women face in their careers. But before you can even get to that ceiling, right, you've got to climb the ladder one
Mhm.
rung at a time. And what you all do in the book really is make the case that it's that very first step, right? That first big promotion to manager where that rung can sometimes be broken. Explain to us a little bit about that, why that early first step is really so important.
Absolutely. Betsy, it's that first promotion to manager that is often missed or delayed for all women. And it's interesting because women are excelling in the United States and, frankly, in developed countries all around the world. In the US, women have 59% of college degrees, right? We enter college at higher rates, we persist and graduate at higher rates. Women are 70% of valedictorians, we have higher average GPAs. We're also the majority of master's degrees and PhDs. So academically, women are excelling. And we've been excelling for about 40 years. That's when the kind of 50-50 started to tip over to more degrees going to women. So we've had plenty of time, 4 decades, in fact, for that to play through, right, for academic excellence to play through into the workplace and to see how, does that really translate? Because presumably the education is supposed to prepare you for the future, for jobs, for kind of
Right.
advancing, and we're really not seeing that flow through. In fact, despite this academic excellence, as women enter the workplace, about 48% of the entry level is women, but then they drop down to 39% at that first manager promotion, right? So we've got a 9 percentage point drop at that first promotion to manager. And if you think about what does the talent pipeline look like in the United States? It's a pyramid. And the base of the pyramid is the entry level workers. 70% of workers in the US are at that entry level. Many will never make it past the entry level. They will actually retire in an entry level non-managerial position, 50, however many years later. And it's that managerial promotion that women are often missing, often even before they're having kids or, encountering some of the other challenges that we talk about in the book. And so that's that first broken rung, the first missed managerial promotion. And I might just share some of the stats in
Sure.
other numbers if you don't mind.
That would be great.
Um, all right. Let me actually start with the overall talent pipeline in the United States. And this is it. I'll just point you to this second to the bottom row.
Hmm.
And it starts off at 48% women at that entry level, and then it drops by 9 percentage points, as we were just describing, to 39% at the manager level. Then it drops by 2 percentage points, 3 percentage points, every single level, 5 percentage points, all the way down to 29% of the C-suite. So 29% of people reporting to a CEO in the United States across all industries, typically more Fortune 500 larger companies, is a woman.
Hmm.
And if you look above that row, women of color, which is here Black, Latina, Asian, Native American, all added together, it starts off at 20% of the entry level, but then falls by two-thirds to
Mm.
7% of the C-suite. So 1 out of 14 people is Black, Latina, Asian, Native American, all added together. So that's that kind of broken rung. It's not that it's the only broken rung that dropped from 48% to 39%. It's simply, it's the biggest, it's the most broken rung. It's the first
Right.
broken rung. It's the rung that everybody either has to make their way through or get stopped by.
And
Uh,
it's also probably the broken rung that people you don't really think about sometimes because you're just kind of going along,
yeah, yeah,
keeping your head down, doing your job, and then all of a sudden you starting to see other people get promoted and you're wondering
exactly.
what's going on here.
Exactly. And I want to put some of these numbers in other kind of stark terms.
Yeah.
For every 100 men who are promoted to that first manager level, 81 women are promoted, but that's a blended average across all races. So it's actually 89 white women, but
Hmm.
only 65 Latina women and 54 Black women. So the promotion rate for men across all races is roughly double the promotion rate for Black women at that first managerial kind of promotion level. And so that's the broken rung that we talked about, the missed or delayed promotion to first manager role.
And before we go into talking a little bit about how we think about overcoming some of this,
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about why you think it's important right now to put this research out there, to have these discussions, to have this book out there for especially for young women who are
Yeah.
entering the work world.
Yeah. Because we haven't seen the academic excellence kind of play through, we're
Mhm.
continuing, decade after decade to see these gaps. And we've done so much research on it. We know all of the reasons why, but it's often our own actions that may be causing some of these gaps to persist. And so we did some research globally and then did a deeper dive in the United States. And about two-thirds of the pay gap in the United States, right? You're probably all aware there's a 27-cent pay gap in the
Yeah.
US for every dollar men make. Women make 27 cents less. And we can explain about 80% of that pay gap. We know exactly why it happens, which means 20% of it is unexplainable. Maybe it's due to things we just can't capture in the data. Could be
Mhm.
bias, could be, you know, unconscious things that are just very hard to measure. But let's focus on the 80% of that pay gap that we can explain. It comes from two sources. Two-thirds of it is actually decisions that women are making for their own careers. And that's exactly why we wrote the book, to your question. How do we better navigate our own careers so that we're not driving two-thirds of that 80%, of the pay
Yeah.
gap? Now, if you and I make decisions to optimize our career, maybe we make a trade-off and we choose a career that's more flexible. Maybe we choose a career that's more aligned with our values, and that is a lower compensation. Wonderful, right? By all means, we should all be making the right decisions and trade-offs for ourselves. But it's not always a knowing trade-off. So, for example, in the US, decades and decades ago, we used to have nurses who were majority male. And as women flooded into the nursing occupation, average salaries went down, teaching, et cetera. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit of the chicken and the egg. Is that you knowingly making trade-offs to align with your values and what makes you happy? Or is that the, work world and job markets, acting in biased and unhelpful ways? So
Yeah.
that's two-thirds of the gap, our own choices. So let's educate ourselves so that we can make the best choices for ourselves. And then one-third of the gap is just different hours worked, right? Around the world, women have the majority of part-time jobs, minority of full-time jobs. In the US, for every 10 years that a typical man is working, a woman is typically working about 8.6 years. I've got 3 kids, so maternity leave is the bulk of that around child
Right.
rearing years. But you also see a bit of a gap in later years when we start to care for parents or
Right.
in-laws and other things. So just more breaks and longer breaks that you see across the average woman's career, resulting in, 8.6 years versus 10 years in the workforce. And so that's just less experience. And that drives about a third of the explainable gap.
And I want to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about the kind of motherhood and caregiving aspect, because you all devote a chapter to that in the book as well. But let's talk about some of those proactive things that we can do if we want to think right now strategically about how we cannot be one of the statistics that you showed earlier on about not, about stepping on that broken rung. How do we get that level playing field,
Yeah.
excel with our choices that we make as soon as we enter the workforce? You all talk about something called experience capital and why that's important. Can you take us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, Betsy. So, experience capital is the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience that you
Yeah,
learn on the job. So, if you think back to your very first day of work, you had, education and your characteristics, of course, but you didn't know really anything about the work world, how to collaborate, how to get things done in a professional environment. Experience capital is all of that you learn on the job. And we did some global research across 4 global countries: US, UK, Germany, and India. And it turns out that on average, half of the average person's lifetime income is from that experience capital, what you
mm,
learn on the job. The other half of your lifetime income is driven by your education and kind of the characteristics that you bring to your first job. And so, just as we were describing before, women are excelling. We're doing exceptionally well at the education part and those other characteristics, right? The first half of what drives our lifetime income, fabulous. We're hitting it out of the park. It's the second half, that experience capital, where we're building less of it because we got 8.6 years per decade of that a man has of experience. And it may be getting recognized and rewarded in different ways as well. So, how can women better build our own experience capital and make sure that it's rewarded in the workplace as well? So, each of the chapters actually talks through early in a career, the first 10 years of your career. What are the decisions that maximize your experience capital? As you think across an entire career, what are the skills? What are the most valuable skills to build? How do you future proof your career skills wise? And then, in the longer term, kind of encountering the inevitable in terms of your, bumping up against bias, conscious bias, unconscious bias, thinking about motherhood on ramps and off ramps, but also your physical and financial health. And so each chapter kind of talks about what does the data tell us? And then, as you were describing before, what are the success stories of women who've navigated these pivotal moments and how have they built experience capital to kind of keep that learning curve, but also the earning curve steep?
and you all write about one of the very first things that you can start to think about as you enter the job market is where you're going to start off, that very first job, and why that is so important and why you need to think really hard about the kind of company that you're going to join.
Absolutely, Betsy. It is the number one thing that women and men can do to maximize their lifetime earnings. And I keep using lifetime earnings as kind of a proxy. Don't think it's not that money is the end all be all. It's certainly not. It's just the easiest proxy that we had to measure ability to negotiate, ability to trade off, right? Your
Sure.
kind of earning value for things that are important to you, whether that's flexibility, whether that's benefits, whether that's a job that's closely aligned to your values. So think of that as just a proxy. It's hard for me to say, Betsy, you made a choice. Are you happier? Am I happier?
Yeah.
With my choices, that's just hard to compare. But to your point, picking the right company, and we say pick a company, not a boss, not the job necessarily, even. If you pick the right company, that is correlated with 50% higher lifetime earnings. That is the highest, best decision you can make for your career. And the right company, of course, we look at this in a very data driven way. The right company does 3 things. The right company invests in your learning and development. And it might be a percentage of your time every week, every month. It might be a strong culture of mutual feedback. It might be just an expectation of lifelong learning. The second thing the right company does is it supports cross functional development. So you won't start in finance and then end there 30 years later. You might go into the business, then go into HR, but you're learning the industry, the business from lots of different perspectives, and you're rotating, you're building skills and stretching yourself. And third, the right company will have a very effective strategy. And you can usually tell this based on how they're performing relative to competitors, market share, if they're, a not for profit, but otherwise profitability. And the great news is you can tell all 3 of those things outside in before you even accept the offer, right? You can talk to people who work there, you can look online, you can understand, do they invest in learning and development? Are they, really supporting cross-functional rotations? How many of the people in your group came from somewhere else in the company?
And those are good questions to even ask in an interview,
Yeah. Yeah. Even
right?
before the offer, indeed.
Yeah, yeah. Because it helps you try to think about those things ahead of time.
Yeah.
You also talk about sort of being the one to try to do these big, bold moves. I feel like sometimes there's this tendency where we think, okay, we're just going to do our job, keep our head down, not raise our hand for opportunities. Maybe we're apprehensive. We maybe don't feel we are confident enough or have the skills enough. But you say you've got to get out there and really be the one that's volunteering for the hard assignments, that's staying late, coming early, doing all of those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Not just, yeah, putting your head down as you describe and doing the work, but like opening your mouth,
Yes.
stretching yourself.
Yeah.
And we call this making a big, bold move.
Yeah.
It's the second biggest thing you can do to build your experience capital and kind of maximize your lifetime earnings. 80% of the people who made a bold move actually increased their income quintile over time versus those who didn't. And what is a bold move? So we measured the percentage of skills that you use in a new job, and the average is 25%. So let's say you take on a new role, you get promoted, 25% of those skills are not skills that you used in your last role.
Hmm.
So think of 25% as the average. Anything more than 25%, 40%, 50%, 60% new skills. We call that a bold move. Now, interestingly, women and men make the same number on average of bold moves across their career. I was pleasantly surprised by this in our research. It's about 1.7 per decade. It's not a lot, which makes sense because the way I describe them, they're, quite stressful. You're really stretching yourself. You're learning a lot every day. Feels like, oof, I've never done this before. It's a lot of learning. It's pretty intense, right? The learning curve is very steep and challenging. And then over a couple of years, you build those skills, you cement them, they become a bit more second nature, and then you can build on that foundation to jump and stretch again. But making those big, bold moves and making them count is really important. And when women make big, bold moves, we're much more likely to stay in the same income quintile or actually even decrease in income quintile. Perhaps we're trading off for flexibility or trading off for, less overt competition. Men are much more likely to increase in income quintile. So if you're going to make a bold move and stretch and build your skills, wonderful.
Yeah.
Let's frame that in a very positive way, but also make it count if that's your goal.
How does someone know when it's the right time to kind of take that leap? Put your hand up for a new assignment,
Yeah.
ask for new responsibilities.
Yeah. I think it's both a professional decision and a personal one. So,
Mhm.
professionally, you may feel like, I got this. I can do this with 80% of my time and energy, and I'm pretty good at it. Probably a good kind of hint that you're ready for a new challenge. We all feel it too, right? You're a little itchy,
Yeah.
antsy, you feel ready for something new. But then I think you typically need to balance that with personally, are you in a good place to kind of really invest? Because that learning curve is really steep and it's probably pretty intense for the first year or two as you're learning new things. So juggling both of those, but I think more often with the right strategy and with the right network to support you to be successful is better than not often enough.
You also write about something that you all call the power alley, which sounds
Hmm.
like a cool bar in DC maybe. But what is the power alley and how do we
Yeah.
think about that?
The power alley is how your organization makes money or generates revenue.
Uh-huh.
So in most companies, it's in sales or distribution. In a tech firm like a Google, a Meta, it would be in product development, product management. In consulting, it's being a consultant. In a law firm, it's being a lawyer. But it's how does your company make money? And in the book, there's a story about Jenny Abramson who goes to business school and she gets an offer to sell ads at the Washington Post coming out of it. And she thinks, I didn't exactly go to business school to sell ads at a newspaper. And she sits down with the leader of the organization and he says, Jenny, I know this isn't glamorous or what you thought you wanted to do, but you need to stay close to the cash register. You need to be in our power alley and learn how we make money. Even if you're just there for a couple of years, you will take that experience to other roles and it will accelerate your career in ways you haven't imagined. And she took the role and did, in fact, experience
Mm.
that. So the power alley is get that experience. It is an intense role, especially if you're in sales, right? Because Betsy, in sales, every day, you know how much you sold. I know how much you sold. We know how much I sold,
There's
and everybody else.
accountability there too, right?
Everybody knows it, right? And so
Yes.
just the pressure, the transparency can be a lot across an entire career. But even if you just do it for a couple years to learn it and then take that experience and knowledge to other roles, that can be so valuable.
Do you wanna talk a little bit about, the section in the book where you talk about building sort of what you think say are the most valuable skills,
Yeah.
that people need to have? Because, you know, there's ways to think about how you're acquiring those skills, what you're doing with them, how you build
Yeah.
them up. So talk to us a little bit about that as well.
Absolutely. Let me talk through this and then would love to take
Yeah,
any questions from the
yeah.
broader group as well. There are sort of four categories of skills that we think will help future-proof your career, right? We call them the most valuable skills.
Mhm,
Number one is networking. And we know
mhm.
that women and people of color tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored. Lots of advice, lots of coffee chats. How did you do this? How did you approach this? What advice would you have for me? But when it comes to really creating an opportunity that didn't exist before, that happens less frequently for women and that happens less frequently for people of color. So how do we close these gaps and get on equal footing in terms of our networks and our relationships? Because we know that 70% of job openings are never even posted, right? They're filled by the people in the room having the conversation, putting your name in or not.
Right.
That's how most of this happens. And women have more narrow and more junior networks than men do. They're somewhere between 14 and 38% less strong than others. And we measure network strength in three ways. Number one is the quantity of relationships in your network. Two is the strength of those relationships. And the third is openness. How many are within American University, for example? How many are outside? Could your network sustain a job change or not? And all
Mhm.
three of those factors kind of factor in. We know that women are 5 times more likely to have only women in their network, which might not sound like a problem on its surface, but then you combine that with the talent pipeline that we were talking about earlier, and I have only 29% of SVPs are women, 29% of the C-suite is women. And then on top of that, let's just take the average female SVP versus the average male SVP. That female SVP is sponsoring more men and more women. And so she's overtaxed from a sponsorship perspective, right? She's less able to support each one of her sponsorees because she's just doing so much. And so when you add all of that together, we need to get much more strategic, consistent, kind of proactive about building our network and making it work for each of us.
And you mentioned sponsors. Can you just talk for a second about the difference between a sponsor and a mentor? Because you say a lot of time we're over mentored but under sponsored.
Indeed. So, mentor is advice,
Yeah.
guidance. How did you approach this? A sponsor would be they're in the room, they suggest your name for a project or a promotion, or they're checking in with you. They're making things happen both with you and behind the scenes to create real opportunities. It's more of a investing your political capital, right? A
Mhm.
personal commitment. I have confidence in your skills, in your trajectory. I'm advocating for you, but like actually making things happen. It's a very different level of proactive action and commitment and opportunity creation, I think, than mentorship. Mentorship, you can mentor dozens of people, actually, and you could probably do it reasonably well. Sponsorship, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, right? Like true sponsorship can only happen for, not that many people.
They're your advocate in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sydney was asking a question here about if you have any actual advice for building that kind of diverse and strong network that you alluded to. How do we do
Any,
that?
yeah. Anything I care about, I operationalize. So
Mm,
let's say I wanted to build my network. I'd decide, what's the appropriate amount, 2 hours a week on
mm.
my calendar. And I would decide how to best use that. Early on, it might be actually reading a little bit academically about like how do you build networks? What are the tips? Then it might be doing coffee chats. I would do coffee chats inside my organization. I would do coffee chats or meetings or, meeting at industry conferences or whatever outside my organization. I would never leave a conversation without asking, who else should I meet? I would also be very clear in these conversations. What am I looking to get out of it? Is it, I'm looking to build the skills to get this role ultimately, right? How have you kind of traveled that journey? What advice would you have for me? Or maybe this is a technical or generative AI skill that I want to build. How could I go and do that? Um, and then getting kind of warm introductions to others. But I think it's more number one, decide how much time you're going to invest in it, hold yourself accountable, really, and then start to systematically do things in that area. And then just get comfortable connecting other people, even in your network, not necessarily for your own benefit, but like, hey, you two have something in common I thought you might enjoy meeting. It's just a good muscle to start to use so that you can activate and really build your network over time.
We have another question here that kind of leads me into sort of the next section, which is sort of confronting bias head on, and of course, the issues about caregiving and motherhood. Monique was asking, she says, throughout my more than 20-year career, I've noticed that women bear the brunt of unpaid labor in the workplace, like all
Yeah.
those volunteer projects. We all know, remember being asked to like do the cupcakes and the birthday cakes for the office, right? What's your opinion of sort of taking on that burden with the relation to career trajectory?
It's a challenge
Yeah.
and it's a balance. So on average in the United States, women do twice as much unpaid care work as men. So that's shopping, cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, taking care of parents, taking care of in-laws, right? All of the cupcake, bake sale,
Yeah.
et cetera, stuff that you mentioned. So double the level is really challenging. Around the world, it's actually 3 to 1. Women do 3 times as much unpaid care work. In India, it's closer to 9 or 10 to 1 that women do versus men. But still, 2 to 1 is no joke, and it requires balancing because we have less time outside of work. We're doing, double duty often, these office work, it's similar initiatives and responsibilities at work sometimes. So that is a real challenge. I would also want to connect that to people as they advance. If you look
Mm-hmm.
at, let's say, a female and a male SVP, the
Mm-hmm.
woman is much more likely to have a working spouse and about 3 times more likely to do all or most of the housework, even if she is earning the majority of household income. So we're much more likely to be burning at both ends, balancing 2 careers and juggling and doing a lot of the housework and balancing on the home front. And that is just factually a challenge, right? Like time is fungible. It has to
Yeah.
come from somewhere. And so I would, really equalize with your partner. I think that, in all of this, it's kind of assumed, but that is the most important decision you can make for your career is choosing the right partner, should you decide to choose one. And then equalizing that across your career and your life is so important. You talk a bit about, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, but what about sort of the unpaid labor in the workforce, like
Ah, yes.
in the office?
Yeah, we'll often talk about that as sort of
Yeah.
office work, right?
Yes.
Um, I would try to do as little of that as possible. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
bit of if I expect you to do it and you don't do it, right, then you're criticized or you're not
Right.
as,
Right.
collaborative maybe as other people are. But it's also exactly the work that does not get appreciated, does not get you promoted, right? It does not get you recognized. And so, some people treat that, in a playful way of like, yes, I'm happy to take the notes, or now, frankly, AI can take the notes, but yes, I'm happy to grab the coffee for the meeting. Like,
Yeah.
let's rotate it so that next time somebody else is doing that, or, all of the things that are not really helping anybody get ahead or build skills. And then I would say, let's also not do that to ourselves. So when there is a seat at the table, like both literally and
Right.
figuratively, taking that seat, taking up our space, and not spending our time on that office work types of activities.
Um, let's talk a little bit more about motherhood because you all have a whole chapter about that. Caregiving kind of sometimes is often treated and thought of as maybe a career detour, but you kind of in the book reframe it a little bit as maybe a source of transferable skills. How do you think about that, and how should we think about that as we contemplate you know getting off the career ladder to be a mother, coming back to work, however long that is? What's your advice on that front?
Yeah.
And it's obviously not a one size fits all.
Oh, for sure. It's such a
Yeah,
deeply personal
yeah.
decision, both to have kids and then how to structure the leave. But we would say buy a round trip ticket, right? When you go out on leave, work with your mentors, work with your sponsors to make sure that you know how and when and or certainly how, if not when, you can come back. I do think the data around this motherhood penalty is a global phenomenon. So around the world, when you compare women with children to women without children, women with children are less likely to get the job, less likely to get promoted, and less likely to get paid more. Versus men, it's the total opposite. There's this motherhood penalty and this fatherhood bonus. So if you
Right.
compare men with children to men without children, the men with children are more likely to get hired, more likely to get paid more, and more likely to get promoted. And the effect goes up the more number of children these men have. And when you dig underneath the data and you ask why, these men are perceived as more trustworthy, more stable, and oh, by the way, they need more money to support their families, right?
Mm.
Meanwhile, the same thought process was not applied to the women with children. And so we see this kind of persistently around the world. And in light of that, actually, we also see that Americans believe 75% of Americans believe that fathers are more dedicated to their work than mothers, right? So this parent penalty, motherhood penalty really is so persistent. And I can give you all exactly identical resumes, right? Same font size, same font type, John Doe versus Jane Doe, or some male versus female name. Now, in that resume test, men and women will ascribe greater leadership and higher future potential to John Doe because we've
Mm.
been so socialized that leadership looks male. Typically, it's tall and white, that we think John Doe is going places and he should probably be paid more. Now, relating to motherhood, I'm just going to change one bullet point on Jane Doe's resume. Everything else is still identical. I'm going to put some flag that she is an active parent. Let's say I add active parent teacher association member, something
Yeah.
quite benign. 87% less likely to get that interview
Mm.
because men and women are thinking, huh, she's going to be an active parent. She's prioritizing her family. She's not going to be as good of an employee. And when 75% of Americans think fathers are more dedicated than mothers, you can tell how consciously and unconsciously that's going to play out in performance reviews, unconscious bias, right? All sorts of things. So, in light of that data, be thoughtful about how you buy that round trip ticket from leave. I think some organizations are getting quite good at their support and how do you build the skills, multitasking, but also kind of risk management, all sorts of things that you're doing as a mother. How do you translate that as you come back, but really working with your sponsor network to make sure that that's a smooth reentry.
And you have some stories in the book about people that have done that successfully.
Yeah, Julie Morgenstern, for example, is a beautiful example of that. She was actually out on parental leave and found herself kind of missing the window to take her daughter for a walk. And she was just so disorganized. She couldn't find her keys and she couldn't find the diaper bag. And so she had this sort of flash forward of like all of these events that my daughter is going to miss because I'm unorganized. And she was a leader in the creative arts space. And up until then had been a strong part of her personality of I'm disorganized, but that enables my creativity. And right then and there, she sat down on the floor after she stopped crying and just having this moment of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to ruin this girl's life because I'm so disorganized. And she organized her diaper bag. And then she created an entire system for busy people to stay organized. She built, a whole business around it, became a New York Times bestselling author. And so just an amazing way where some of your weaknesses can become your strengths, but also be the springboard for entrepreneurship.
That's great. Couple other questions here I wanted to get to. Back on the issue of making bold moves,
Yeah.
Carolyn is asking, and I think we see this a lot. Obviously we have an institute here on women in politics, and this
Yeah.
comes into respect too when we think about women putting their, taking that step to make a run for office. Sometimes
Yeah.
they might feel they're underqualified, they might feel uncomfortable. So how do you think about when making those bold moves and applying to jobs with like significant a jump in skills? How do we overcome sort of that we don't feel qualified enough,
Yeah.
kind of that little voice in our heads?
I think partly knowing the data
Yeah.
helps because if you know this is true on average, you might, sort of get a bit more stronger gumption and believe in it. And then just understanding that nobody ever feels fully ready, right? It's going to be a stretch for anybody, but getting more comfortable with that over time. Um, a dear friend of mine was telling me a story the other day, and she told me this story about Brad and this woman that she had been mentoring and sponsoring for a long time. And this woman wanted to become the head of this group and was getting her master's degree and doing kind of different classes after work and was building up over so many years for this perfect job that was kind of her dream job. And they actually offered it to her. And she said, hold on, I'm not ready. I just need to finish this one course. I need to finish this master's degree that I've been doing part-time for so long. And then I will be ready. And it will be kind of do the job, this amazing job that I've loved and like really wanted to have for so long. It will do the job justice. So they looked around and they saw Brad. Brad was an amazing networker, made everybody feel comfortable, really kind of easy to talk to. And they offered Brad the role, and Brad took the role,
Of
had
course he
no
did.
experience in this
Yeah.
field, like literally no experience in this field, but he was a very quick learner. And he talked to everyone and said, look, I'm new in this space. Tell me what I need to learn to be successful. And he actually did a very, very good job and took the role, unfortunately, for a very, very long time. And so my question for some of us would be, what would Brad do? Right? How
Mm.
do we be more like Brad? Not totally like Brad. Hopefully, we're more qualified than not really having any experience in the field, but a little more Brad would be good for all of us. And so maybe that's your girlfriends that help you in that moment channel a little more Brad. We
Mhm.
have some funny sayings in my dear friend group where we kind of encourage each other in these moments. Um, but I think that's just critical. Know the data, know kind of your own personal, proclivities, and then push yourself to be uncomfortable. Because when we stretch ourselves, when we make these bold moves, that is when we're growing the most. And if you can frame that in a positive way and just know
Right.
you're going to try your best and that's all we can ask, um, and you're going to do it on a foundation of really good skills, like just grow from there.
And back on that similar issue of kind of sponsoring and mentoring, Taryn has a question about how can organizations themselves, so how can workplaces take the initiative to shift that mindset of sponsoring women and not just mentoring them? How can they actively play a part in sponsoring female success and leadership? So I guess what responsibility do companies have to try to, and what should they be doing
Yeah.
to help facilitate that?
I'll give you a few examples of things that I think companies are doing well. One is in the succession planning.
Hmm.
We often talk about the Rooney rule of just, at least one diverse candidate on the slate. In succession planning, you want two or more diverse candidates for every role, and you don't want any woman or person of color to be the succession candidate for more than two roles, right? I don't want the same set of few women, few people of color across all of these roles. I want that to be a broader and deeper bench.
Mm.
It's a little bit like board seats, right? The average woman on a board is on, I think, 4.2 boards. The average man on a board is on, I think, 1.2 boards, right? So typically men are doing this while they're CEO or on the side. It's one of many things they're doing. Women are making a bit of a career of it, maybe in this kind of later stages of their career. But that means we have far fewer women across the same set of boards, even as board seats slowly get more diverse there. And we don't have as broad or deep a bench as we would want.
So speaking of diversity, and you're the diversity officer for McKinsey as well. We have a question about what do you think about the long-term impacts, if any, would be a result of all of the DEI changes that we're seeing in the current administration? How do you all
Yeah.
think about that?
Yeah. Um, I think I'm proud of kind of the stance that we've taken on, a diverse meritocracy that we talk about
Mhm.
internally. We want both diversity and meritocracy, and at their best, they reinforce each other. I think as I look outside, there's sort of three flavors of companies or organizations that I've seen. I've seen some that have truly backed away. And I would say this is more in the consumer driven kind of spending categories where, a social media campaign orchestrated in a certain way can really shift spending patterns. And they have backed away, I would say, both truly and quickly
Mm.
from some of their earlier stances. There's a middle set of companies that have called it different things. So maybe it's employee inclusion, but the spirit and the work itself is still the same. So maybe instead of sponsorship just for women and people of color, it's sponsorship more broadly. But we know again that women and people of color are under-sponsored. So disproportionately, it will help that population. I think that is more of a in name only, but in intent and action, most of it is still the same. And I think there's a third category of company that has not backed away at all, and is still driving the same things. Because at the end of the day, we are in a very competitive talent market, especially
Right.
for highly talented people. And talented people want to work in a diverse and inclusive environment, right? So my straight white male colleagues also want to be included, right? They may be an introvert in an extrovert's environment. They also want inclusion and they want to work in that environment. And so in a competitive talent market, I think many companies, especially B2B ones, but frankly, a broad set, have said, we're staying the course. This is really important to our talent strategy, and talent is what we have.
Well, and that goes back to what, we first started off talking about was, when you're applying to jobs and thinking about companies you want to work for, making
Right.
sure that you're at a place that values diversity.
Absolutely.
Right. Let's see. We have another question from Allie. She says, "What tips do you have for what types of experiences to highlight in your resume and interviews, and which ones are not valuable to include?"
I would, in your resume and in the stories, the leadership stories you tell,
Yeah.
do a couple things. One, I would quantify anything you can, right? The more objective, the more clear, quantifiable it can be. It just helps people who weren't there for the story or the experience know what actually happened. Having interviewed many, many people for McKinsey, I will say I do think there is on average, gender gap in how women and men talk about the same leadership experience. I will
Mm,
hear often from women, I was so fortunate to get the opportunity to do this. My sponsor made this happen. I was so happy our team did this. I'm not interviewing or hiring your team. I'm either hiring or not hiring you, right? I
right.
don't want to hear about how lucky you were. The same experience from a male candidate might sound like, here's what I instigated, here's what I made happen. And so I took the initiative to do this. I wasn't there for either experience. It's hard for me to parse that apart. I know enough now, being trained on a lot of this,
Right.
to dig a little bit deeper, right? Like, what was your specific role? Talk me through that. How did that conversation play out? But it is hard to parse that apart in a 1 hour conversation. So quantify as much of the experience on the resume as you can, and then on the resume itself, I would talk about your role. I would use very active verbs. And then two types of skills I might signal more than you already have. One would be social and emotional skills. In the book, we talk about this as soft
Mm,
skills. And I think there's this
yeah.
misnomer that they're less valuable. No, absolutely not. In fact, soft skills are increasing much more than any other type of skill in the United States in terms of what we will be needing for the future.
Give us some examples of what soft skills
Yeah,
are.
absolutely. So negotiation, showing empathy, leadership, um, reading a human interaction and reacting accordingly. When you think about the difference between a good leader and an amazing leader, that's all soft skills, right? That's all of the inspiration, all of the other things. And it's because it's very complementary to generative AI, right? Generative AI is doing a lot of the basic judgment things quickly and with high quality, but it cannot yet do the fundamentally human elements of showing empathy, inspiring a team to achieve something we didn't think was possible. Even negotiating, right? It can give you some tips, but it can't actually build the trust, create the win-win, in the same way that a human can. And so I think there's this myth of like, hey, you're either born with it or you're not, right? These soft
Right.
skills or social and emotional skills. And just like we were talking about earlier with networking, you can absolutely build these skills. You can say, I want to get better at negotiation or showing empathy or whatever it might be, and systematically build those skills. But those are the two
And
I would signal a bit
communications
more.
and presentations and things like that as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's great. That's really good advice. Speaking of AI, I wanted to ask you about that. But
Yeah.
as we think about sort of all these rapid changes in the workplace, what advice are you giving young people starting their careers today, sort of in this age of AI? What do they
Yeah.
need to know how to do?
Get tech savvy. And
Yeah,
I don't mean tech savvy like learn how to code, right?
code.
Because
Yeah.
yeah, generative AI can code better than I'm ever going to learn to. But what I mean by kind of build tech skills is interact with technology, interact with generative AI, start to understand its impact on your role, on your group, on your company. Be a bit of that translator and somebody who can kind of lead in your group or in your area for these tech changes, help drive adoption and the change management. Actually, it's the change management that's the hardest part of all of this. We often advise that for every dollar you're investing in the tech or the generative AI side, you should be investing a dollar in change management and kind of behavior, upskilling, et cetera. So I think being that translator and getting comfortable with the tech skills is critical. And what we see for women is women, especially younger women, are less comfortable and experiment less with generative AI. We
Hmm.
don't see the same gap at kind of middle age or older ages, but at the younger age, and I think what's driving it is back to that academic excellence. Young women are so used to getting the straight A, acing the test, and they don't want to be perceived as cheating in any way, right? So if
Mm,
this is not my work, I don't want to present it as my work. This is my job. I have
right,
responsibility
right.
here. And so they're really uncomfortable experimenting with generative AI and what might they perceive as not their work. So when companies, how companies can kind of close this gender gap at the younger ages is to be explicit about how we want you to use generative AI, right? So for these people, processes and reviews, please use generative AI. This is an expectation or experiment in this way. Do not use it in this way. The more explicit companies are, then we do see those gender gaps close. And that I think will be really powerful because if we are left behind, if we're not experimenting in the same ways, it's going to be really challenging in the next 5, 10 years.
That's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about sort of confronting bias head on because you
Yeah.
have a lot of different aspects about this in the book as well. And I think the likability one
Yeah.
just jumped out at me as something that I feel women always seem to face,
Yeah.
especially as they kind of move up that ladder into leadership and managing people. That
Yeah.
ability, that notion of like, I want to be liked. I don't want to be the, you know what, boss, right? How do you think about advice for women in those leadership skills when it comes to likability?
Yeah.
We see this
It
in
is.
politics too, obviously.
Yes, yes, deeply, deeply, very parallel there.
Yeah,
No, it is this catch 22, right? Of you want to be liked, but then if you're liked, you're not viewed as a leader because those are very different kind of traits that are perceived, and so you can't be perceived as both. I think it's more just experimenting with what feels authentic, but
yeah.
yet kind of strong. Um, and some things may feel awkward at first, but then you kind of grow into them. So you might kind of experiment with presenting in a certain way, see what feels like it works for you. But I think it's more a balance between feels authentic and is effective at work, and then just trying it. You might have a buddy who gives you feedback. You might just kind of test yourself what feels okay. And then just this sort of trial and error to find that, very narrow balance point between strong and leadership and
Mhm.
kind of the person that you want to be at work, whether that's likable or not.
And what about trying to confront some more overt biases that
Yeah.
women see in the workplace? And do you think that these are getting better, getting worse? And how do young women, how do you counsel them to try to speak up in these kind of situations?
Yeah. What we see in the data is that women and people of color encounter bias much more frequently in the workplace than our male peers. Um, and this could be conscious bias, it could be unconscious bias. And I think the important thing is how do we advocate for ourselves and speak up when it happens to us? How do we
Yeah.
advocate for others when we see it happening, right? Live in the meeting, somebody
Hmm.
takes Betsy's idea and gives, credit to someone else, or I question Betsy's authority in her area of expertise, or I mistake you for somebody much more junior, right? These things happen much more systematically. Black women are much more likely to hear negative comments about their style, their aggressiveness, their personality. Women in general are much more likely to get feedback on how we dress versus, actual performance in the role. And so all of these things, how do we find allies to more proactively help advocate so it's not always us, raising the issue? And then
Right.
how do we advocate for ourselves and others when this does happen? But I think the book gives you a helpful vocabulary for bias because there is external bias, right? When you see me, what do you think? When I tell you I have 3 children, what do you think? Back to our parenthood piece, but
Right.
also internal bias, right? And we were talking a bit about this. What have I personally internalized about the notions of woman and family and woman and work, and how I relate those concepts actually is deeply predictive of whether I would hire an equally qualified woman for a job versus a man. And we're all biased. We're all biased in a multitude of ways. It's just important to understand in what ways, how biased. If you want to understand how biased you are, you can go online, the implicit association test. It's tested
Mm.
over 6 million people, right? In terms of gender, race, age, ability, right? All sorts of dimensions. How biased are you? How quickly you associate two words together is highly predictive. And so let's just all understand that because I think in bias, we sometimes assume it's other people, it's not us, but it's all of us. And how do we recognize that and stop that from happening? So, for example, um, women all of a sudden, actually, as Sheryl Sandberg started to talk about lean in and some of the gaps between
Right.
genders, women all of a sudden started to, negotiate for their own jobs, titles, raises at similar rates to men. And that gap closed overnight, one of the fastest gaps I've ever seen close, just because
Mm.
of awareness, articles, right, discussions about
Hmm.
it. But when a woman negotiates, she is 3 times more likely to be perceived and given feedback that she is selfish, bossy, pushy. And this is both from men and women, right? And so,
Mm.
how do we understand that, but also start to change that as part of the system and part of organizations?
Um, Carolyn's asking about how can women develop kind of those leadership skills as they move up the ladder. And I guess to that same point, I'm curious also of advice that you would give to women who feel stuck, like they're waiting for that next big opportunity that doesn't seem to be coming their way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think talking with people, so this is back in the
Mhm.
mentorship space, not
Yeah.
necessarily sponsorship yet, but talking with people about what are the skills. So let's say you want to get promoted to this particular manager role. What are the skills that are critical for that role in that group? What are the gaps that I have to get there? There's a story in the book about a woman in Spain, and she wants to have her manager's role, who's actually leading all of Google Spain. And she sits down with him and says very explicitly, when you retire in 3 years, I want to be ready for your role. Number one, what are the skill gaps that you see? What do I actually need to work on? Let's make a plan for that together of how I can test that and build those skills. And number two, who do I need to know? And how can they see me in action so they feel comfortable with me when the time comes in 3 years? And they together create this plan and execute it. But I think it's these overt, explicit conversations about what are the skills that I need to build? How do we make that plan together so I'm not just building them on my own and hoping you notice? It's a
Yeah.
real partnership, and we're moving in the same direction as a team.
Yeah, that's such a great story. And I wanted to ask you if there were any other stories that you want to highlight or that stayed with you the most when you were collecting some of these great stories for the book.
Yeah. One towards the end, and it's
Mhm.
Beth Smith, and it really highlighted the need for financial independence for each of
Mm,
us and to get more involved in our financial lives. And we led some research around women's health. And it turns out, right, we all know women live longer than men on average. Wonderful news. And this is true around the world. But women spend 25% more of our years in poor health versus men. I had no idea about this and was frankly quite appalled. We also spend more money on healthcare, which makes sense because we're living longer and 25% more years in poor health, like stands to reason. On the other side of that, our retirement readiness is much lower. Frankly, retirement readiness across the US is abysmally low across the board, but it's even lower on average for women, right? Because we got the majority of part-time jobs, we're working less years,
right.
we're just saving less for retirement. And then on the other side, we need to stretch that retirement savings for longer, given healthcare
Yeah.
spend and other things. That is just not a mathematical equation that works. And that's in sort of best case scenario. Say you have a partner and you stay together, right? If you don't stay together, that's a totally different set of financial issues that needs to be sorted through. And so the story of Beth Smith is around she sees her mother kind of going through some of these decisions, doesn't take her mother's advice early on, but then gets much more involved in her financial decisions. And it's a very systematic kind of category by category. Okay, my mutual funds, how do I understand what's in there? Okay, my bank account, how do I like get educated and optimize that? And over time, gets herself ready and actually is able to retire early because she was so focused on getting involved in her financial health. And I'll give you a couple examples. At McKinsey partners get free financial counseling.
Oh,
80% of our male partners take advantage of it. Only 20% of our female partners do, right? You would think selection bias, like we've been through
yeah, that's
certain funnels, we
fascinating.
should act similarly, but we don't. And so my push to all of you and Beth Smith's kind of advice would be just get involved, even if it's to average level of education. That's where the biggest bang for your kind of investment is in your financial life.
And how would you recommend doing that? Because I agree, and I see this anecdotally with young people who are not really being taught, in the college level either about basic financial issues of insurance and, employee benefits. How do you recommend if they're not working at McKinsey and don't get their personal financial advisor? How do you recommend getting smart on some of these topics? What
Back to the
resources you have
operationalize
there?
it, right?
Yeah,
Maybe it's not 2 hours, maybe it's an hour a week, and you
yeah,
just start reading. And Beth
reading.
Smith in the book does start to read a little bit, watch some, YouTube videos.
Yeah.
You got to pick them carefully because there's also some not great advice out there. But just start to get a bit educated about how do I think about insurance and the categories and what do I
Hmm.
need, including renter's insurance when I'm younger. How do I
Right.
think about investments? How do I think about kind of bonds and all of that? So I think it is just knowing it is a priority, and investing a little bit of time to get educated. And that,
Hmm.
getting to that average knowledge is so important just for
Hmm.
independence, but also just long-term security.
I will say I remember in college at AU there was a personal finance course that I took, and it was one of the best classes I ever took because it did teach me all of that. So that when I did start in a
Absolutely.
career, I understood to invest in my 401(k). I understood what a matching was. I understood long-term disability. So hopefully AU still offers that. I just would recommend if anybody is interested to check and see if AU still offers it because it was a great course and it does put you on a good path. Let's see, one closing question here. Let's see, it's for women who do advance along the career ladder. What advice do you have in terms of not being alienated from other women who may still be in those entry level positions? In other words, you get promoted, you're now the boss. How do you not alienated from the rest of your colleagues? How do you navigate being not just the boss?
Yeah. I think people see the authenticity in the intent. So if you're kind of
Uh-huh.
spending time and trying to help others, right?
Yep.
How do you be that woman who, after you've climbed up the ladder, you leave the ladder down and you try to help others climb up the same ladder, as opposed to kind of pulling the ladder up behind you? And I think if you, with like genuine intent, help others climb the same ladder, right? What advice would you have? How do you share that? How do you help others if you are in the room? Um, Navigate that same promotion. And I think they will receive that with open arms and be very grateful. I also think women's employee resource groups,
Mhm.
connectivity, advice, all of that can help build relationships as well.
And one other quick question. Donna's asking, what was the resource for the implicit bias test that you mentioned?
Implicit association test
Okay.
online. Yeah.
And you just Google that?
Yeah. IAT. But yeah.
Okay, great. And I want to let everybody know before we go here that we have an event coming up in 2 weeks on campus, an in-person event where we're going to have Christine Brennan, who's a wonderful sports columnist for USA Today, and she's written a new book about Caitlin Clark and her meteoric rise. And we're going to talk to her and what that means for women's sports today. And we're also going to have the AU deputy athletics director and one of our great women basketball players, who's a sophomore at Kogod School of Business with us. So we hope that you all can join us for that event. You'll be getting an email and you can register and check that out as well. So Kweilin, thank you so much for being here with us. This has just been it's
Yeah.
such a resource, and I feel like everybody got smarter, and you gave us lots of things to think about and dig in further. And I know we have the link to the book in the chat if anyone's interested in ordering that from Amazon. But it's a really great resource, and I recommend it to everybody who's kind of thinking about your next steps in their career ladder. Don't step on that broken rung.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thanks everybody for joining us.